Thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. So welcome to this sixth of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news even while I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast. I hope it helps you feel more up to date. So welcome to episode 6 about neornithischians and ornithopods. I recorded October 18th, 2025. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Buzzsaw Party Boy from the album Charlemagne, and the outro is Sleepyhead from Snail's self-titled debut album Snail. So this episode we're catching up on neornithischians and ornithopods. I've looked this episode over and it's a big one. In fact, most of these dinosaur recaps have been awfully big. What's been fun for me making these episodes is listening to my voice as it dissolves when we reach the end of an episode. I was not meant to talk this much, but I do it because dinosaurs rule. So here we go. Today's episode is on neornithischians and their transition into ornithopods as we move from the Middle Jurassic into the early Cretaceous, maybe the late Cretaceous, something like 170 million years ago to 130 million years ago, making this approximately 40 million years of evolution being investigated in this family of dinosaurs. And by the end, we'll cover a few interesting additions to that span into the late Cretaceous. We'll see. All right, neornithischians are a diverse clade of ornithischian dinosaurs. Ornithischians are the bird-hipped herbivores, you'll recall, named because their ischium or hip is oriented similar to that of the hips in modern birds, which is only the more confusing because somehow birds evolved from the lizard-hipped Saurischian dinosaurs, not the bird-hipped ornithischians, but that's got nothing to do with today's episode. The neornithischians is a term coined by Michael R. Cooper in his 1985 paper, A Revision of the Ornithischian Kangnasaurus coetzeei, with a classification of the Ornithischia, published in the Annals of the South African Museum. He was looking at the characteristics of dinosaur fossils and said, quote, "The present classification of the Ornithischia, in particular the Ornithopoda, is unsatisfactory, while earlier classifications recognized horizontal grades rather than monophyletic lineages. Since the writer follows Santaluca in 1979 in regarding the presence or absence of an obturator process to the ischium as of prime taxonomic importance, a new classification of Ornithischia is proposed. This proposal reshuffled all kinds of definitions and made it necessary to name a new order, Neornithischia, which means the new Ornithischians. The earliest of these dinosaurs were bipedal, with forelimbs modified for grasping, and they were the forefathers of the marginous cephalians like Triceratops and hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus after tens of millions of years of evolution. But they started small, around 3 to 5 feet in length, specializing in eating plants and conifers. Oh, and there's a recurring theme in the articles in this episode too. Early ornithischians are frustrating to work with. And some of the articles will discuss why in greater details, but that's definitely part of what makes this group of dinosaurs interesting. They have a problematic, convoluted, and frustrating taxonomic history. So let's get started. Given that description, let's see what our first article tells us. Enigmacursor mollyborthwickae, a neornithischian dinosaur from the Upper Jurassic Morrison Formation of the western USA, was published in the Royal Society Open Science Journal in March 2025. It introduces us to a new neornithischian called Enigmacursor. This is a great new animal to start off with because its name refers to the puzzling and convoluted taxonomic history of small-bodied ornithischians. In this episode, we'll discuss the convoluted history of neornithischian animals, but let it be known the scrappy remains and overzealous paleontologists who were eager to name new dinosaurs back in the late 19th century has resulted in a troublesome taxonomic task every time a new neornithischian is to be described. Enigma obviously is a reference to its frustratingly difficult familial relationship to the original neornithischians like Nanosaurus and Othnielia and Leosaurus, all these woefully incomplete and undiagnostic jumbles of specimens that were problematically described as formative members of this lineage of dinosaurs, but are too awful to refer new specimens back to. In a paper we'll cover in this episode shortly, these same authors, Drs. Susanna Maidment and Paul Barrett, of course a terrific guest on episode 70, The Inside Man, outright recommend to officially declare a bunch of the earliest described neornithischians as nomina dubia, and for them to be, quote, set aside in the interest of taxonomic stability. In other words, these specimens don't possess the qualities necessary for future discoveries to be compared against, and having to restudy them every time neornithischian research is being done must be somewhat on the spectrum of frustrating and infuriating. In any case, Enigma honors the taxonomic history of small-bodied ornithischians from the Morrison Formation, and cursor is Latin for runner. The species name honors Molly Borthwick, whose, quote, generous donation allowed the Natural History Museum of the United Kingdom to acquire the specimen, making this the enigmatic runner, thanks to Molly Borthwick. The holotype NHMUK PVR 39000, housed at the Natural History Museum of the United Kingdom, was uncovered from the Morrison Formation. It's comprised of a partial skeleton including 3 teeth, 3 cervical, 11 dorsal, 2 dorsosacral, and 5 caudal vertebrae, 10 dorsal ribs, 5 chevrons, the right sternum, both scapulae, both humeri, both radii, both ulnae, 3 metacarpals, the left ilium, right ischium, right pubis, both femora, both tibiae, both fibulae, the right astragalus, and both pedis. It was uncovered from a section of the Morrison Formation that's in Colorado, and of course, the Morrison Formation is famous for its huge and charismatic megafauna. The Allosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, and Stegosaurus. Some of the biggest and most famous Jurassic dinosaurs are known from this incredible rock formation. Quote, Enigmacursor is the most complete three-dimensionally preserved small ornithischian from the Morrison Formation and one of the most complete from the Middle-Late Jurassic globally. Enigmacursor can be distinguished from all other known specimens of Morrison Formation small ornithischians, demonstrating that many of these indeterminate remains likely represent a second, currently undiagnosable taxon. This indicates that although the fossil record of these small dinosaurs is poor, Morrison ornithischian species richness was likely higher than currently accepted. They add, quote, the discovery of Enigmacursor enhances the diversity of ornithischian dinosaurs from the Morrison Formation and provides new information on their anatomy. In addition, it demonstrates that there is additional cryptic diversity of small-bodied Morrison Formation ornithischians, suggesting they were a more diverse component of the late Jurassic ecosystems than was previously realized. First, new information about their anatomy. Enigmacursor is represented by much more complete three-dimensionally preserved skeletal remains than any previously named early diverging ornithischian specimen from the Morrison Formation, and it can be characterized by one possible autapomorphy and a unique character combination, primarily based on the femur. This is great because should researchers take Maidment and Barrett's recommendation to trash the lousy earlier fossils as nomen dubia and started using the Enigmacursor holotype for the purposes of comparison with future neornithischians research, this will be much, much easier. So like fingers crossed or something for everyone involved in this. Second, cryptic diversity in the Morrison Formation. There are lots of fossils of neornithischians from the Morrison Formation. That's clear. Quote, but their diversity has been obscured by outdated taxonomic practices that failed to distinguish between simplesiomorphy and synapomorphy, which, like, who would ever make a mistake in those things, right? But upon their exhaustive review of all the materials, of which, as they lament, it's hard to tell anything apart from each other, because none of these remains are especially diagnostic, the researchers are confident that there are at least 2, and probably more, distinct species known from the described material that contains Enigmacursor and other animals like Frutidens, Nanosaurus, Drinker, Leosaurus, and Othnielia. Quote, there remains the possibility that these specimens do not represent the same taxon and that diversity was even higher. More specimens are needed to test this hypothesis, but the need for detailed stratigraphic work accompanying the discovery and excavation of new specimens is of fundamental importance in disentangling true diversity. So switching from the Kimmeridgian of the late Jurassic in North America, this next article about a similar animal from maybe 5 to 10 million years earlier in China is what we're going to talk about. The paper, a new neornithischian dinosaur from the Upper Jurassic Tiaojishan Formation of Northern China, was published in the journal PeerJ in July 2025. The animal is called Pulaosaurus quinlong, where Pulao refers to a mythical dragon-like creature, and Quinlong refers to the county in Hebei province where the specimen was found, making this the Pulao lizard from Quinlong. Now, is this a dragon? Not really. Its head was 5 centimeters long, so it's like the size of a big squirrel. So, this was discovered in the late Jurassic Tiaojishan Formation, which contained cololites, which are fossils from the remains in your colon. Hyoids and an ossified larynx, which are for vocalization, along with basically an incredible imprint of the entire animal in its completeness. Quote, this well-preserved specimen, IVPP V30936, helps us understand the biodiversity of Yanyao biota and the phylogeny of early diverging neornithischians better. The Yanyao biota is, quote, one of the most significant Mesozoic terrestrial Lagerstätte in China. And, quote, there has been 54 genera and 58 species of vertebrates reported from the Yanyao biota, including 9 species of non-avian dinosaurs. Unusually, especially compared with other Chinese fossilized terrestrial faunas like the Xingshugu and Shaximao, the Yanmiao has only one known Ornithischian species, and even that might actually be from the J-hole biota, so that they're not sure about that. So this new Ornithischian discovery is special because it's found in an assemblage that, quote, lacks neornithischian dinosaurs. As described earlier, the early taxonomy of neornithischians and ornithopods is filled with, quote, early attempts that haven't held up over the course of time, as new discoveries have been made. Obviously, science is a journey towards truth, so the first steps are only the beginning of the journey towards understanding. One of those early steps was that this family was once named Hypsilophodontidae, which has, quote, been controversial in recent years, especially for the early diverging taxa referred to as Hypsilophodontidae itself. The early neornithischians are believed to have derived in 2 significant ways, branching into a family named Sauropoda, a group which went on to be the ancestors for the ceratopsians and Chylosaurs and hadrosaurs, and the second smaller lineage that went on to become Thescelosaurids, which we'll get more into later in this episode. All of this is to say, quote, the controversy over the phylogeny of early diverging neornithischians stems from the differences in the morphological characters selected in the different phylogenetic analyses. So, the discovery of a new early diverging neornithischian species helps to clarify relationships among early diverging neornithischian taxa. And this discovery is an early diverging neornithischian taxa, and its preservation is exceptional. So this is important. Quote, there is a temporal and geographical gap between early diverging taxa found in the Middle Jurassic strata of southwestern China and late diverging taxa found in the lower Cretaceous strata in northeastern China. Quote, the discovery of Palaeontologia fills the temporal and geographic gap of neornithischian fossil record in China and provides new information on the biodiversity of the Yanyao biota, say the authors, adding that, quote, the diversity of Palaeontologia in Upper Jurassic Tiaojishan Formation also suggests that Asian neornithischian taxa originated near or within the Middle Jurassic Age Sichuan Basin and spread to northern China during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. This indicates that the geographical isolation of the Yanyao biota was not as large as a preventative faunal barrier between other regions as hypothesized. The phylogenetic analysis recovered Palaeontologia as, quote, one of the earliest diverging neornithischians yet described. Moreover, it represents the second known dinosaur to preserve ossified laryngeal elements, thus suggesting that a bird-like vocalization evolved early in non-avian dinosaur evolution. The next article is one we covered back in the Marginocephalians episode because it had some interesting things to suggest regarding pachycephalosaurs, but the article in its greater purpose was to review all the small-bodied Morrison Formation ornithopods in a paper called A Review of Nanosaurus agilis and Other Small-Bodied Morrison Formation Ornithopods in Bulletin of the Peabody Museum of Natural History in April 2025. When Barrett and Maidment named Enigmacursor in our first news story, it was after the taxonomic labyrinth created in the 19th century. There are a bunch of discoveries of small-bodied ornithischians that were discovered in the old bone wars, including Nanosaurus agilis, Nanosaurus rex, Laosaurus celer, Laosaurus gracilis, Laosaurus concors, and Drinker nisti, Othnielia rex, Othnielia concors, and Othnieliosaurus. And frankly, the point of the article was to review all the materials of these things and see if any of the taxonomy could be cleared up. Because Othnielia and Drinker and Nanosaurus and all these different genus names have frustrated paleontologists. Turns out these animals were all described and named after fossils that are considered, quote, non-diagnostic. So the animal Drinker, for example, was named after some fragments of jaws and teeth and bits of arms and legs and a bit of vertebra. But the problem was there wasn't anything especially special about these bones. They sort of just looked like a bunch of other critters' arms and legs. Could be juvenile iguanodonts, could be ornithischian, could be an ornithopod. It's just too basic. It didn't make any sense. The authors say, quote, none of the relevant holotypes or syntype series exhibit either autapomorphies or unique character combinations that could be used to support their validity, and we regard all of these taxa as nomina dubia. Most of these specimens can be identified only as indeterminate neornithischians, but some include juvenile iguanodontian remains. More problematic, after these animals were named, subsequent discoveries from the Morrison Formation were referred to these species, to which the authors say, quote, "Other specimens formerly referred to these taxa should be regarded as indeterminate until they have been restudied in detail in order to establish their affinities rigorously and determine the true species richness of the Morrison Formation Ornithischian fauna." After laying out their case, they conclude, with the exception of the heterodontosaurid frutidans, Hagororum, none of the named small-bodied Ornithischian taxa from the Upper Jurassic Morrison Formation can be considered taxonomically valid. The type specimens are either fragmentary, poorly preserved, or incompletely described, and all lack autapomorphies or unique character combinations. Most of these specimens represent indeterminate ornithischians or neornithischians, but some contain indeterminate juvenile iguanodontian material as well. This is why in the Enigmacursor article, they argued to name all these basic beasts as nomina dubia, and for them to be, quote, set aside in the interest of taxonomic stability. It would be a real benefit to anyone studying neornithischians, especially from the Morrison Formation, to not have to try and refer their new discoveries to these unfortunately sloppily named species. It will be interesting to keep an eye on how researchers move forward in this realm. Our next Ornithischian news article is on new species from the late Cretaceous of the southern United States. This article was published in September 2023 in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, and it describes the new species Empelognathus coenei in an article named "The First Small-Bodied Ornithopod Dinosaur from the Lewisville Formation of Texas." Empelognathus was uncovered from a spillway off Grapevine Lake on land managed by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and the fine millimeter-scale repetitive laminae of sand, silt, clay, and carbonaceous materials is consistent with a depositional environment in a tidally influenced back island lagoonal setting, says the paper. The holotype DMNH 2021-05-02 has the Perot Museum of Natural Science, formerly the Dallas Museum of Natural History, was excavated from the Lewisville Formation, and it's comprised of just a lower jaw. In particular, it's a complete left entry and the root of one of its teeth. It gets its name from the Grapevine Lake, where Ampelo is Greek for grapevines, and Gnathus is Greek for jaw. And its name honors Murray Cohen, the fossil enthusiast who discovered the fossil making this Cohen's jaw from Grapevine Lake. The authors appear to believe that Empelognathus had retained the bipedal posture of its Jurassic ancestors, and it has become the first small ornithopod known from the Lewisville Formation. In fact, few ornithischians at all have been discovered there. Quote, "Its presence adds to the diversity of fossil organisms known from the lower middle Cenomanian deposits of southwestern Appalachia, a time and place with an otherwise poor record of terrestrial ecosystems." As more data comes in from this formation, the authors recommend, quote, "more comparisons and contrasts with similar aged paleo ecosystems preserved in units after the final separation of Laramidia and Appalachia by incursion of the western interior seaway. This should, quote, provide a better understanding of the pattern and timing of floral and faunal divergence and the resulting tempo of evolution on both sides of the western interior seaway through the remainder of the late Cretaceous." The authors note that the way the jaw is positioned, they interpret Empelognathus's teeth to have been pointed somewhat inward, more so than in other ornithopods. The phylogenetic analysis machine suggests that Empelognathus coenei is, quote, more closely related to Thescelosaurus, Tenontosaurus, and Iguanodontia than to Hypsilophodont grade ornithopods, such as Jeholosaurus, Haya, Hypsilophodon, and Convolusaurus. However, they add, quote, support for their relative positions of taxa in the ornithopod clade are not well supported. And when they say support is not well supported, they're talking about that exact same thing that Barrett and Maidment were saying in the Nanosaurus article before, and it's the same troublesome phylogenetic details that gives Enigmacursor its confusing name. Every time we're talking about these ornithischians, paleontologists can't help but make it a matter of record just how frustrating working with this family of dinosaurs is. The next article is Anatomical Description and Digital Reconstruction of the Skull of Jeholosaurus shangguanensis from China, published in PLoS ONE in January 2025, where the authors used microcomputed tomography scans on juvenile neornithischian skull YLSNHM01942, which is housed at the Yinlang Stone Natural History Museum. As the article says, this is the skull of Jeholosaurus, which is a, quote, small-bodied ornithischian from the early Cretaceous Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province in China, initially described by Xu et al., based on two nearly complete skulls and partial postcranial material. They add, quote, the phylogenetic history of the species is complex, especially due to the instability of the basal portion of the Ornithopoda tree. And where have we heard that before? Oh yeah, in every article about small-bodied ornithischians. Juras-Sick was described back in 2000, and at that time recovered as a, quote, basal member of Ornithopoda in an unresolved polytomy with Hypsilophodon. After new discoveries, redescriptions, and more data in the phylogenetic analysis machine over the past 20 plus years, Juras-Sick, well, frankly, it still isn't entirely sure where it fits amongst its peers. Every new study seems to yield different results. But here's the latest study, and the latest results for now. Quote, even though Juras-Sick was already scored in different matrices, the excellent preservation quality of YLSNHM01942 allows to score characters previously unknown in the species. Not only that, the authors also added a new species into the matrix of comparable animals like Transylvanosaurus and Changmiania, and updated another animal that had been included, which has been re-evaluated to be a basal ceratopsian in Aschioceratops. Furthermore, details on a species of Psittacosaurus and Yinlong were updated along with the updates to a lot of Juras-Sick character scores too. In other words, this analysis will have the most current and available data yet. The results recovered Juras-Sick as a basal ornithopod, most closely related to Nanosaurus. That's the problematic one. And Changchunosaurus and Haya, which are two similar ornithopods that Juras-Sick has been recovered to be closely related to more than once. These are recovered as quite basal, even more so than the Thescelosaurs. But more importantly than narrowing down where Juras-Sick fits in the greater scheme of ornithopods, the microcomputed tomography scan recorded incredibly detailed results on the 5.9 centimeter skull. This is handy because, quote, different phylogenies describing the evolutionary relationships of Ornithopoda are mostly based on cranial features. However, there is a lack of well-preserved and complete skulls for the basal members of this clade, hampering our knowledge on the mode and tempo of these herbivorous dinosaurs. So you can see, in this case then, having an incredibly well-preserved and scanned and interpreted and described ornithopod skull from one of its most basal members would be tremendously useful in the story of the macroevolution of this family. In the end, however, the authors admit humility. Quote, we recognize the fact that this result does not clarify the early evolution of ornithopods, as other phylogenies based on different sets of characters provide different scenarios. Nonetheless, the inclusion of Changchunosaurus and Juras-Sick demonstrate the importance of the Chinese ornithopod fauna to reconstructing the basal relationships within the clade, reinforcing the hypothesis that the clade originated in the Eurasian regions. Our next article has a lot of interesting nomenclature in it, but not dinosaur nomenclature. I'm sure you'll find it interesting all the same. It does relate to a new dinosaur, though. This next paper is about a more derived species of small ornithopod, a new Thescelosaurid, named in a July 2024 paper published in the Anatomical Record called A New Semifossorial Thescelosaurine Dinosaur from the Cenomanian-age Mussentuchit Member of the Cedar Mountain Formation in Utah. First off, I had to look up the pronunciation of Mussentuchit, spelled Mussentuchit. The etymology of the name goes back to cowboys riding around and saying must not touch it because the water was poisonous. So that's what I really found. I can't vouch for its validity, but that's why I'm pronouncing it like Mussentuchit. In any case, back to this new critter, what makes Thescelosaurids more derived than the earlier small-bodied ornithopods that we've been covering. Thescelosaurines still have that primitive bow plan reminiscent of the earliest Ornithischian lineages, and were a group of small to medium-sized herbivorous dinosaurs that inhabited North America during the late Cretaceous. And they're characterized by bipedal locomotion, an elongated upper jaw called a rostrum, bearing a keratinous rhamphotheca, which is the hard keratinous outer layer that covers a bird's beak. And then they had leaf-shaped cheek teeth and semi-conical premaxillary teeth, shortened forelimbs, rib cages overlain with ossified plates, and neurosensory systems adapted for low-to-the-ground posture and possible semi-fossorial behavior, which is burrowing and digging. So these are bumpier and spinier animals which may have spent more time burrowing and digging in the dirt. This Mussentuchit location is aged to be late Cretaceous, and the youngest Cedar Mountain Formation member, representing an approximately 800,000-year window into the world of Laramidia's eastern shores prior to the Greenhorn cycle in the western interior seaway. As an aside, apparently the inland sea is documented to have had big ebbs and flows in its breadth and depth over the millennia, as you can imagine. The shoreline went high and low. The remains and disarticulated materials from multiple specimens found at what is called the Mini Troll locality, which was discovered by Lisa Herzog, who has dedicated much time to the paleontological collection, care, and conservation of fossil specimens worldwide at the North Carolina. The remains are disarticulated materials from multiple specimens found at what is called the Mini Troll locality. This locality was discovered by Lisa Herzog, who has dedicated much time to the paleontological collection, care, and conservation of fossil specimens worldwide at the North Carolina Science Museum. And this new animal is named Fauna herzogae. The name has quite of a backstory to it, just like the Mussentuchit Formation, so I'll share it as they describe it in the paper. As it is published, Fauna, from the Austronesian language Fino-Chamorro, the ancestral Magahoge of the Chamorro people, is Fauna, whose name can be translated as the origin. With her brother Pontan, whose name can be translated as a ripe coconut, they became the first paramount female and male chiefs, the ancestral Magahoge of the Chamorro people, ancestrally venerated according to the Chamorro tradition. According to oral history and legend, when Pontan's spirit began to perish and die, Fauna discovered her new powers and uses them to craft parts of Pontan's body into the pieces of the universe. His eyes were turned into the sun and moon, his eyebrows became the rainbows, his back the earth, his chest the sky, his blood the ocean, and from his stomach and penis the mountains and the sacred creation point stone pillar were born. Fauna had such sorrow from the loss of her brother that her tears flowed down his body to form the currents of the sea, and in reverence to her brother's dreams, she decided to bring life to the universe, throwing herself into the earth, where her body turned to stone. From her fossilized body sprang forth the first people of Fuha Rock, imbued with her good spirit. This ancestral story of the Chamorro people mirrors the life and death of the Thescelosaurine dinosaurs at the Mini Troll locality, as there were at least two subadult individuals that may have been male and female, or perhaps siblings. Additionally, their bodies fell into the earth where they too fossilized. This naming, rooted in the story of Pontan's sacrifice and Fauna's love for her brother, highlights the Chamorro values of Enafa Molak, to make good for all, and Giftau, the need for compassion, selflessness, and familial bonds, the importance of the equality shared between men and women, and ongoing efforts to decolonize paleontology. So that's why Fauna was a fitting name, and Herzogae honors Lisa Herzog for her, quote, unparalleled dedication to the paleontology program at the North Carolina Science Museum. The holotype NCSM 33548, housed at the North Carolina Science Museum itself, was uncovered from the Cedar Mountain Formation. It's comprised of a partially articulated, nearly complete skeleton. And this paper also refers other remains to this species. So there were 2 adults and bits from another more juvenile member. In all, lots of fossils to research here. The authors say, quote, the presence of a distinct Thescelosaurine taxon in the Mussentuchit member supports the hypothesis that the ancestors of Thescelosaurus were present in North America as early as the Cenomanian, co-inhabiting the continent with their sister taxon Orodrominae. To date, members of these clades have not been found together, suggesting different habitat preferences. Shared ecomorphology with and close phylogenetic affinity with Oryctodromeus demonstrated here supports a shared semi-fossorial lifestyle, which again supports burrowing and digging dinosaurs, which I'm always excited to hear about. And they add Fauna herzogae adds to the cryptic diversity of the Mussentuchit member dinosaur fauna, serving as an important component of this exceptional mid-Cretaceous ecosystem. All right, the next few articles are about ornithopods, more generally, rather than about specific animals, beginning with intraskeletal histiovariability and skeletochronology in an ornithopod dinosaur from the Maestrazgo Basin, published in the Journal of Anatomy in January 2025. The researchers used a new specimen of an indeterminate iguanodontian ornithopod found in Spain, and they reviewed sections of the axial and appendicular bones to identify, quote, intraskeletal histiovariability. That didn't mean anything to me, but this apparently means to investigate the differences in bone tissue structure and growth patterns found within a single individual skeleton. Or, in other words, instead of a uniform growth rate throughout a skeleton, some elements within a skeleton grow at different rates than other parts. And you can think of a baby's legs versus its skull as it matures. When drawing kids, for example, like when you're drawing pictures, the body of a kid, its head is like 5 head lengths in size, whereas an adult is like 9 head lengths in size, because kids have comparatively larger head to body ratios than adults. So we're talking about like different bones at different types grow in different speeds. Apparently, even parts of the same bone can be affected by this, where part of a bone grows faster than another part of it as you mature. Axial and appendicular bones means they studied the skull, vertebral column, and rib cage, which form the body's central axis, and the arms and legs, which are appendicular, think like appendages, if that helps make them more familiar sounding. But so appendicular means their appendages, and axial means kind of their upper body, not counting the arms. So this is what they studied. They used a, quote, 3-front model on these ornithopod bones, which is a model previously used on sauropod bones in 2014. What is the 3-front model? It was a model developed to conceptualize the similarities and divergencies between long bones of different sauropod animals, and specifically analyze the, quote, interaction between 3 fronts: the apposition front, the Haversian substitution front, and the resorption front. So guys, this is only getting more confusing, but onward we go. The appositional front is the outer surface of a bone. The Haversian substitution front is a series of microscopic tubes in the outermost region of the bone which accommodate blood vessels and nerves. And the resorption front is where minerals in the bone are resorbed into the blood. So this study looked at how bones grow and change throughout an individual as it grows and changes for the first time in ornithopods, with the host to reveal the, quote, microanatomy of the Iberian iguanodontians in a deep and systematic way. Let's be clear, I can barely wrap my head around the concept of this study, let alone understand what is going on. But in their conclusion, they say that their iguanodontian specimen was approximately 9 to 12 years of age at its death, had reached puberty at the age of 7, and it was sexually mature adult. Properties identified through the 3-front modeling suggest, quote, it's possible to determine which anatomical areas showed the greatest potential to preserve a primary paleohistological record. So, they hope this model is applied in the future to perform more detailed analyses of different bone elements in ornithopod taxa to clarify which bone elements are most suitable for studying each taxon, as well as what type of growth dynamics can be established on the basis of their phylogenetic relationships, which is sort of saying they're on their way to validating a process which can be relied upon to strengthen the interpretation of growth dynamics and phylogenetic relationships. So it's a stepping stone in an important direction. Staying general, the next article is How Femoral Morphology Informs Our Understanding of the Evolution of Ornithopod Locomotion and Body Size, published in the Journal of Paleontology in May 2025. The paper reminds us Ornithopoda is a dinosaur clade in which, quote, secondary quadrupedality is represented, in that the macroevolutionary story tells us that though they were once bipedal, as most small-bodied ornithischians were, they evolved to become secondarily quadrupedal, which is associated with a big increase in body size. So the research question was, when did they evolve from obligate bipedality? Some researchers have made hypotheses based on footprints, or ichnology, and others on a, quote, mosaic of bipedal and quadrupedal skeletal features. Yet, a, quote, straightforward inference of such ability is complicated by the concomitant evolution of enlarged body mass, hence confusing the interpretation of skeletal features as related to quadrupedality or weight support. In previous 3D geometric morphometric studies, the locomotor specializations from enlarged body mass was distinguished in various archosaur femora between everything from Triassic Pseudotsuchians to Cretaceous theropods. And the authors of this study wanted to, quote, better characterize ornithopod specializations by analyzing 41 femora using 3D geometric morphometrics and comparing the results with those of the aforementioned studies. The paper says the authors succeeded in demonstrating that ornithopods, quote, evolved from some femoral specializations to body mass and locomotor habits that are consistent with other studies, previous findings for other clades of dinosaurs and archosauriforms. By comparison with the previously demonstrated femoral specializations in closely related clades, it was therefore possible to better characterize the evolution of ornithopod femoral morphology with increasing body mass and changes in locomotor habit. For example, when looking at the femoral shaft of Hadrosaurus, as the shaft straightened, it is associated with quadrupedality, among other observations. This all suggests that quote, hadrosaurs were obligate quadrupeds, and non-hadrosaurian ankylopalexians and Rhabdodontidae may have some facultative static bipedal abilities, which remain to be investigated. So, I guess based on the straightness of the femur that one discovers, they might be able to infer that they were more or less quadrupedal. So more straight means more quadrupedal, less straight, maybe they were, or less quadrupedal. They're suggesting that, I presume, more research will support this when it's done. In another paper, an analysis of the first fossil remains of Styracosternan ornithopod dinosaurs from the early Cretaceous of La Rioja and its paleobiogeographical implications, published in the Journal of Palaeontologia Electronica in August 2025, freshly described ornithopod skeletal remains recovered at the El Horcajo site in La Rioja are identified as an indeterminate Styracosternan, which is a type of iguanodon-like animal. The fossils they describe are a caudal vertebra, a fragment of humerus, a bit of carpal, which is a hand bone, bits of the left tibia shaft, and some fibula. This basket of flaky bits of bone aren't enough to declare this a new species or to refer it to an existing species. They're just too badly preserved. But they are diagnostically referable to a type of ornithopod. How do they take these scraps and compare them to meaningful fossils? The paper says they used a multivariate analysis consisting of a principal component analysis, a PCA, which compared the caudal vertebra with data obtained from measurements of the caudal vertebrae of other ornithopod taxa. And then there's something about a base 10 logarithm, past version 4.03 software, and statistical data. You get it. They did science to compare the scrappy bits to the better stuff already on the record. Quote, considering the current evidence of the similarities between the fossils examined in the Ornithopoda dinosaur taxa mentioned above, quote, considering the current evidence and the similarities between the fossils examined and the ornithopod dinosaur taxa mentioned above, as well as considering the results of the PCA, the most likely interpretation is that the fossil remains belong to Styracosternan ornithopods. Is referring a bunch of chunks to a general type of animal important in the grand scheme of things? Not really. But what is interesting is that this confirmed that this Styracosternan is now the oldest Styracosternan remains in the early Cretaceous of the Iberian Peninsula, meaning that these types of ornithopods inhabited this area in Iberia about 7.2 million years earlier than previously reported. So it's expanded their paleogeographic range over quite a period of time. That last article helped to describe the presence of ornithopods. This next article is hoping to describe an absence of them. In the article, first dinosaur ichnofauna from the Bauru Group indicates Cenomanian-Turonian events led to an Ornithischian hiatus in the Upper Cretaceous of southeast Brazil. In the journal Cretaceous Research in December 2024, they have found the footprints of animals that are not yet known through body fossils in the Santo Anastasio Formation in Brazil. There are some partial tracks attributed to, quote, minute bipedal Ornithischian, although they, quote, are also tridactyl and have digits relatively elongated. Based on the track sizes, the estimated hip height for the track maker averages between 45 and 47 centimeters, and the body length ranges from 1.5 to 2 meters long. These proportions are comparable to those of some Ornithischian specimens from South America, such as the ornithopod Gasparinosaura and the Basalthyreophoran Jacopil caniacura. However, the pedal anatomy of the latter taxon is unknown, limiting further comparisons. In any case, these are reportedly the first dinosaur tracks found in the Bauru Group, which features all kinds of types of animals like 4 distinct types of meat-eating theropods, including an abelisaur, a megaraptoran, and an alvarezsaur, as well as ornithischians such as the ones described above, as well as medium-sized iguanodontian, a very heavy iguanodontian, a quadrupedal ankylosaur, and possibly a notosaur as well, as a small sauropod, like a Rebbachisauride. So small sauropod, though, is not an ornithischian. What's most interesting is that the ichnofauna represented by the footprints is incongruent with the body fossils found in the Bauru Group, which is overwhelmingly just titanosaurs and crocodiliforms. And most importantly, it totally lacks ornithischians. This total absence of ornithischian body fossils has been named the Ornithischian Hiatus, which is especially pronounced in the Coniacian and Maastrichtian deposits in Brazil here. This study suggests that the successive environmental fluctuations during the Cenomanian-Turonian interval may have led to regional extinctions or migration of Ornithischian dinosaurs to higher latitudes. Higher latitudes means they're less likely to wind up in a depositional formation. because water flows downhill. If they go uphill and die up there, they don't get fossilized. This faunal shift is theorized to allow specialized crocodiliforms to occupy the niches of small-sized primary consumers previously filled by thyreophorans and ornithopods. Meanwhile, titanosaurian sauropods dominated the medium to large herbivore roles in these paleo ecosystems. And finally, the last paper here was published in the journal Alcharinga, an Australian journal of paleontology in August 2025, called Articulated Hind Limb of a Small-Bodied Ornithopod Dinosaur from the Cenomanian-Age Creek Formation of New South Wales, Australia. Despite small-bodied ornithopods of the late Cretaceous being uncommon from a global perspective, they are actually fairly well known in Australia, represented by species like Atlascopcosaurus, Enigmacursor, Gallionosaurus, Liolenosora, and Quantasaurus. And this paper describes yet another. Now, even though quite a few species have been described, associated or articulated remains are exceedingly rare. In fact, only 2 associated dinosaurs or accumulations have been described from this interval after more than a century of collecting. Which means is when they find one of these animals, they find bits of just one. They don't find a collection of them or an assemblage of them in one place. They don't find, a second species nearby. They just don't find that stuff. This paper says 2 further undescribed specimens, AM-F106298 and AM-F127930, have been collected but not yet described until now. Quote, here we describe the best of these 2 specimens, AM-F127930, a well-preserved left femur tibia and astragalus of a small-bodied ornithopod which was discovered in an open-cut mine in the Wyoming or 10-mile opal field, approximately 10 kilometers to the northwest of Lightning Ridge, by miners Bill and Yudi Kotru, probably sometime during the 1990s. Quote, importantly, the specimen was identified in situ and excavated by hand by miners, as opposed to being haphazardly exhumed by mining machinery, which is the typical mode of recovery at Lightning Ridge, during which processes the femur and tibia were inadvertently broken. This newly discovered specimen represents the first articulated postcranial remains of the best represented small ornithopod currently known from the Grimmin Creek Formation of New South Wales. While the remains are incompatible for comparison against all known ornithopods of Australia, the ones by which it can be compared, like Lewisville, Fostoria, and Muttaburrasaurus, are confidently not the same animal. Quote, whether AM-F127930 represents a new taxon or pertains to Weewarasaurus pobeni or any of the unnamed morphotypes currently recognized from the Grimmin Creek Formation is uncertain. Although size-related differences cannot be accounted for, several features appear to be unique to AM-F127930. So they got a new critter. It's not anything that you can really name anything off of, but it does seem to increase the diversity of ornithopods in a place where they happen to be well represented for a change. So, in conclusion, neornithischians and ornithopods have a challenging taxonomic history, but perhaps it might be cleared up as new, more complete fossils are recovered, as in the description of Enigmacursor, who provides a new lens through which neornithischians of the Morrison Formation can be viewed. The discovery of Palaeosaurus suggests that early neornithischians of China first evolved in the Middle Jurassic of Sichuan before dispersing throughout the continent, and that they may have already, at that point, evolved bird-like vocalization. The Nanosaurus article took great steps to demonstrate that the quality of the specimens and the taxonomy conducted with them serves to muddle and confuse any research being performed in the field of small-bodied ornithischians, and has lobbied to revert many of those 19th century descriptions to nomina dubia, so that the work may progress in the field without having to continuously resort to the deleterious remains that serve as the holotypes of record. The authors say it's for the greater good. Quote, the authors say it's for the greater good. Quote, although it's regrettable that these historic names should be set aside, it removes the historic burden of attempting to shoehorn new specimens into existing but dubious taxa, and will allow future work on similar material to proceed on a firmer basis. The Juras-Sick skull scan has reinforced the hypothesis that the clade originated in the Eurasian regions. The new Thescalosaurid fauna Herzogii adds diversity and clarity to small-bodied ornithopods in the late Cretaceous, with more support that this was a family of dinosaurs that were adapted for burrowing and digging. And there have been some new studies that will be contributing to the greater conversation around ornithopods, like a process that encourages which types of ornithopod bones to use for osteological and histological analysis, or a process that helps indicate whether an ornithopod is an obligate quadruped or not. The age of styracosternan ornithopods in the Iberian Peninsula has been expanded by 7.2 million years, thanks to the discovery of some chunks of bone, which will have some macroevolutionary and paleoecological ramifications. Ichnofossils have proven that ornithischians existed in the late Cretaceous of Brazil, even though no body fossils have ever been discovered in the Bauru Group. The trackways identified lots of animals, but in particular multiple types of ornithischians, ornithopods, and ankylosaurs. So that's relieving. They knew ornithischians must have been there. They've just been very hard to come by so far. And some old bones, if you think stuff in the 1990s is old, were finally formally described, contributing novel information on the directiveness of the ornithopods from southeastern Australia. And to wrap up, I sent out a query asking about what it means to suggest or to ask for or to declare that a bunch of animals be declared nomina dubia, as was suggested by Barrett and Maidment. And so I heard back, and 3 contributors. I want to say thank you to Adam Yates, Sky McDavid, and Tom Holtz Jr., who is a terrific guest of the show in episode 54, Return Part 3, who provided details that give you this answer on what to expect from that. Bestowing the status of nomen dubium may be suggested by any taxonomist author, and when published, that status may be accepted or not by the general scientific community. There's no official process or petition. You just publish it. And once published, that status is citable, meaning there's some academic precedent that can be referred to. In any case, if the argument is strong, future researchers may cheerfully accept the update if they are convinced by the argumentation, or ignore it. But if so, they will be compelled for their justification in rejecting it. But definitely, there's no decision that's made out there like a Supreme Court at the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. And of course, their opinions may change or be subject to revision when new information arises. So for now, if researchers are in the future are won over by Barrett and Maidment's argument to name a bunch of old animals nomen dubium, they're welcome to. And if they disagree, and if somebody disagrees, there'll be an argument as to why, and they will, I guess, continue to bang their heads against the wall with some of these old animals. So anyhow, after all of that, I hope you feel like you're more caught up on what's been published on neornithischians and ornithopods lately. Thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. Dinosaurs Lately itself is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, the podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. And if you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, the Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you feel you're all caught up on neornithischians and ornithopods for now. Until next time.